This is Aarushi Gupta. I'm from the Social Protection Initiative at Dvara Research. Dvara, as you all know, is a policy research institution based out of Chennai, India. And over the last decade, we worked extensively on a lot of issues, systemic issues that concern India's financial sector. In the last 2 to 3 years, we've sort of ventured into the government domain where we look at social protection initiatives introduced by both central and state governments. And we've divided, the social protection team at Dvara has divided our body of work under 3 broad themes, starting with activation of insurance markets, then universalization of a comprehensive social security system, and lastly, looking at some of the delivery mechanisms of social welfare measures. And this is what we're going to talk about in today's presentation. The project that Aishwarya and I are going to introduce today broadly falls under the last mile delivery theme. So I'm just going to share my presentation now. Right. So the title of our project is Delivery of Social Welfare Entitlements in India, and some of the sub-themes that we explore under the project is exclusion, looking at people who've been excluded from the welfare pipeline due to a variety of issues that we delve into details later on. Second is looking at grievance redress, broadly how these excluded people enter back into the system, using either informal or formal mechanisms of redressing their grievances and complaints. And lastly, simply by virtue of having collaborated with a civil society organization for this project, we also look at the key role CSOs play in the last mile as an essential cog to sort of navigate the welfare system that has been put in place by government departments. I also have my colleague Aishwarya with me. She's a research associate at Social Protection Initiative, and she will also be covering a couple of parts of the presentation. So I'm just going to skip this slide, Kevin, on the SPI because I've already introduced. Right. So today, I think we start the presentation by looking at one particular individual, and this would also help us set the context of the kind of work we've done in this field. We start with a farmer from Uttar Pradesh, one of the northern states in India, from Ghazipur district. And we know that he owns less than 2 hectares of land, and therefore he's eligible for PM Kisan benefits. Now, PM Kisan is an income support scheme offered by the central government, under which you receive rupees 6,000 per year in 3 installments or tranches. And it's a very easy registration process. It's a list-based registration that all eligible farmers are enlisted by the state government, and all that a farmer has to do is provide his or her land documents to prove their eligibility, and they will soon start receiving their installments. Now, in this particular case, we spoke with Amit back in June 2020, and he informed us that he's been trying to enroll himself into the PM Kisan scheme since February 2019. So it had already been around 1.5 years. He'd been trying and hitting a variety of access points to get that installment. And during the conversation, he relayed to us his entire experience of having dealt with government departments, typical bureaucratic delays, as well as coordinating with Granbani, which is our CSO partner for this project. To simply go into more details for Amit's case, we see, I first of all provide a broad timeline of the entire issue, starting from February 2019, right down to January 2020. Now, we see in February 2019 that Amit submitted all his documents to a local government functionary in his village. And these are mostly in the form of village registrars who form the lowermost tier of the revenue system. He submitted his documents in February 2019 and kept awaiting for his application to be processed and his funds to be released. It was only in August 2019, around 5 months later, that he went to a common service center, which are local access points that are based in villages, which would enable you to access a lot of digitized platforms for welfare schemes. Once he conducted a status check with the help of an internet kiosk operator, he realized that the bank account number that has been linked to his application is somebody else's, right? And this Of course, we are unable to investigate as to why such an error occurred, but it seems like a typical data entry error by one of the computer operators. Following August 2019, following the status check, we see that he is redirected to a lot of government departments. He's advised to go resubmit his documents at various levels. So we see that he first resubmits his Aadhaar copy, his bank account copy at the village level. But to no avail, he still doesn't receive any benefits. After 3 months are passed, he again approaches, he again resubmits his documents, but this time at the district level. And this is again with help of Granbani volunteers who assist him in taking him to the district office or the agricultural district office. But you see that at both these access points, he is charged money for that particular service. So we see that at the village level, he's charged rupees 200, which is compared to the typical average income of a marginal farmer in India. It seems like an inordinate cost for a benefit of rupees 6,000 annually. Second, even back in, so this is after 4 months in January 2020, he is told that you need to resubmit your documents again, but because it seems that whatever information you're submitting is yet to be updated in the backend systems by the state government. So right up to January 2020, there is that maze that he has had to navigate. He's had to make a couple of payments, and he's also had to, and these are what we in welfare literature typically categorize as search cost, right, while accessing one's payments. As of June 2020, which was the last time we spoke to him, we know that the issue was pending at the state level, and by then he had foregone benefits of rupees 10,000, which is the amount he should have received had everything gone correctly. And second, he's incurred by now a monetary cost of rupees 1,000, sorry. And the total time that has lapsed is 16 months. Okay, so these are, like Amit's story was one of the many stories that motivated us to sort of conceptualize an exclusion framework, which would help us understand the various challenges or impediments beneficiaries face in accessing their entitlements. And these could be in any of the stages. They could start at the very beginning, which is maybe I am a deserving beneficiary, but the targeting methodologies that have been employed by the government do not accurately target me. Either they leave me out from the list that has been designed, or either the proxy means test do not do justice in identifying distress metrics for particular segments of the population. So that is what we typically categorize as E1 kind of exclusion. And what you will see, something that's peppered over in the entire presentation, are these 4 codes: E1, E2, E3, and E4. And each particular code corresponds to a specific exclusion stage. So in case a person has been excluded in the pre-entry stage itself, it would be an E1 type of exclusion, which is in the targeting methodologies, you're excluded from enumeration itself. Assuming that you were accurately targeted, we move on to the second stage, which is the registration process or the enrollment process that form part of the scheme machinery. And these broadly include submission of documents, submission of your application, and the back-end processing of the application and approval that the government has to give to sort of make you enter the welfare system. So that is E2. Assuming that you were accurately targeted and your application was successfully submitted, that itself is not a guarantee that you will receive money into your account. So this is what we categorize as back-end processing exclusion, or E3 exclusion, where we see that the processing of payment files has somehow failed. And there are a variety of reasons behind it. And not just Dvara, a couple of other research organizations and activists are also actively looking at why is it that certain payments are failing to a set of beneficiaries. And lastly, our last stage of exclusion is the cash withdrawal. Something very typical to last mile issues is that even if you receive the money into your bank account, are you able to successfully access that cash? Do you have robust cash out infrastructure in your vicinity? And these issues, especially the cash out issues, are specifically exacerbated for a lot of areas in remote villages and hamlets, which in general have poor connectivity, right? So what we've presented right now is an exclusion framework very specific to cash transfers. And before going into the project, we realized that we need an exclusion framework that would be able to sort of cover more than just cash transfers, given the variety of welfare schemes India has. So we also have MGNREGA, which is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. We also have public distribution system, which is an in-kind transfer of commodities such as food grains or kerosene oil or any daily essentials that can be used by a household. And lastly, we also expand our exclusion framework to the Employees Provident Fund scheme, which is a scheme specific to formal sector workers. But we realized when we looked at how these schemes worked, we could parse out an exclusion framework that was specific to each of these schemes. I've already covered the DPT scheme framework, and just to quickly give you a summary of how our MGNREGA exclusion framework looks. So to begin with, we've divided all the schemes into 4 key stages. The first stage is the pre-entry stage. It would comprise of all of targeting methodologies and the eligibility rules as described earlier. The second stage is entry stage, which is primarily related to application processing to register yourself under a scheme. The third one, which is a very interesting stage for us, which has been one throughout the project, is of benefit processing. Now, benefit processing, when it comes to DPT, implies the failure of benefit crediting as one of the exclusion points. But for schemes such as MGNREGA and PDS, where they do have certain idiosyncratic processes, benefit processing includes much more than simply processing of a payment file. So in case of MGNREGA, we define benefit processing stage under 2 subcategories. First is the work allocation category, and second is wage payment processing. So how MGNREGA works is that any registered worker under the scheme can approach the local officials demanding work for a specific number of days. He or she is allocated work therein, and after work has been allocated, the person proceeds to finish the job assigned and is accordingly paid a given wage. So what we see under MNREGA are 2 points of exclusion within benefit processing. First is we saw a lot of cases was that work was not allocated at all, right? So this is where the beneficiary falls through. Even when the work is allocated, it might be the case that it isn't allocated for the number of days the person has demanded the work for. Right, so all these issues fall under the work allocation category. The second subcategory within benefit processing for MGNREGA goes back to the typical issues that in MGNREGA that have been covered in much more detail in other literature segments, is that the processing of the wage payments, either they might be delayed or either they might completely fail as well. Moving on to the last stage, which is endpoint. Endpoint was typically for cash transfers. It means all the cash out issues, and based on our secondary and primary research, we've divided those issues under 3 broad heads, which is availability of access points, that whether you have an accessible cash out point in your vicinity. Second, operational issues, and these would broadly encompass issues related to network failures that might occur while you are at the cash out point. Second, any biometric failures, given that a lot of cash out points now employ biometric machines to authenticate people who come to withdraw their cash. And third is overcharging, and again, a very interesting category where we do see instances of last mile operators demanding money to simply enable the transaction for the customer or the citizen. Similarly, you will see that for PDS, the endpoint wouldn't involve cash out issues, but it would be another complete gamut of issues related to how a person collects the ration from a fair price shop. And these include typical accessibility issues, that maybe the fair price shop is closed or is not available or has erratic operational hours. And this was an issue that we saw got exacerbated during the COVID-19 outbreak and the consequent lockdowns. The second is authentication failures, where again, your biometric might fail and you might be denied ration. Lastly, a broad category under non-compliance. And we've tried to categorize issues such as the fair price shop officer not cooperating, either overcharging or not giving you the exact quantity that has been entitled to you as a below poverty line household. And similarly, we've done the same for the Provident Fund scheme, where we've looked at the eligibility rules for PF. We've also looked at the registration process of PF, where two key points of exclusion emerge. One is simply the details of the employee records that might lead or create difficulties for you to access your Provident Fund amount. Second, the registration process might itself be quite cumbersome, and that registration can either be of the employer within the Provident Fund or the employee himself or herself trying to register. The benefit processing stage of Provident Fund broadly consists of the contributions that the employer and the employees have to make on a regular basis. And lastly, fund withdrawal issues is basically when an employee wants to withdraw a certain amount from their fund and the kind of difficulties they face therein. Right. So moving on to the specific project, now that we've introduced the broad analytical framework that we used, we had three key research objectives to begin with. The first was to analyze user-generated content to simply understand the challenges citizens have faced in accessing their welfare entitlements, right? And this sort of helped us create a taxonomy of issues or challenges that also populated the previous frameworks we've detailed, and helped us create like a complaints repository that would represent the entire spectrum of issues faced by people. And this is again across schemes. The second research objective of our project was to understand how volunteers from Granbani try to assist citizens in resolving some of these grievances specific to welfare entitlements. And of course, we'll go more into the details of the Granbani model in the next couple of minutes. And this particular segment of our project helped us understand some of the resolution pathways that are used by civil society organizations. And lastly, we proposed a set of standard operating procedures that can be adopted by other civil society organizations who are engaged in similar fields, a document that can be used as a ready reference. So in case there is a citizen who approaches a civil society organization citing issues with Aadhaar linkage, so we've created a set of steps that the CSO can undertake to help the beneficiary get back into the system. Right. Now, coming specifically to the backbone of the project, which is the Granbani model, and to discuss how we went about collating these complaints, how we went about documenting the resolution pathways. We start with the IVR system, or the interactive voice response system that Granbani operates, where it receives on average 10,000 calls per day of citizens simply dialing in and discussing their grievances. Now, these grievances might be specific to a welfare scheme, or they might be specific to any other local issue they might have been facing. And it's quite a brilliant platform, because it's a dial-in system where the person has to simply give a missed call. So it's completely free of cost for the citizen who is dialing in to report the grievance. After the person has registered the missed call, the system would return the call within a designated time of 30 seconds. It is then the voice message is recorded by the citizen and it's expanded to the voice spot format. And in a lot of cases, Granbani does not only use these citizen grievances as inputs, but the system also tries to disseminate information specific to welfare entitlements and enrollment procedures, simply considering the complexity of a lot of these processes. So there is that provision of users listening to information, which is a key gap that the model covers. Once the grievance has been recorded, the grievance is then internally assigned to a specific handler from the Granbani ecosystem. And these handlers are volunteers who are mostly based in same regions as the complainant. And what happens next is there is a manual moderation within 3 hours, and the handler is assigned based, of course, on expertise and location. So this is the kind of system that we tapped into to generate or look at the a repository of complaints, right? Now, in addition to the repository of complaints, we also see that the Granbani volunteers record impact stories. Now, these impact stories are simply description of what they did to help the citizen, right? And how they went about resolving their issue. And these also provide us with rich information on how as to a relatively more well-informed volunteer has helped a citizen navigate the welfare system, right? And once this particular documentation has happened, of the particular complaint, we see that the handler is assisting the user. And this redress, of course, may be online or offline. We see that the volunteer may physically visit the citizen, may physically engage with the citizen, go about from one access point to another, helping them navigate. Or it might simply be an online process of just logging into a website and correcting their details. All right, so just a quick snapshot of what I think this page really summarizes the project in its entirety, which is we look at some of the various modalities that Granbani volunteers have used, and that includes issue escalation to higher officials. It might also include emergency measures. So during the COVID-19 lockdown, we see that a lot of citizens called in citing food distress and money distress, saying that we are stuck in a different city, we've run out of money, we do not have food, we can't access a ration shop. And we see that the Granbani volunteers mobilized themselves and also undertook a lot of community mobilization where they could provide direct assistance to these people in the form of ex gratia food or cash. Next, we see help being given in the form of simply information, telling people how to navigate the system. And next is group redressal, where in case Granbani volunteers encountered issues that were really large in scale, they were being faced by many people, they undertook group redressal strategies, which we would detail later. And lastly, we do see that intermediation with access points happening. So if a person complains saying that my fair price shop officer is not cooperating with me, he or she is overcharging for even 2 kgs of grains, can you please come and help me and talk to him? We see volunteers doing that as well. Now, coming to simply the impacts that have been realized, we see that there is an immediate relief in a lot of cases that has been provided to citizens. We see enrollment happening. There is receipt of delayed payments. There's correction of inappropriate last mile delivery protocols. And there's also that sheer creation of entitlement awareness. Right. And we see that in its entirety, when we look at the model, it serves 2 key purposes. One is that it broadcasts issues and impacts on community platforms, which really enhance accountability and transparency, specifically for localized governance structures. And second, Granbani has also ran a couple of local campaigns in the form of Rosy Roti campaigns, which we will detail later on, which helped them create advocacy around issues that could have been taken up, that should have been taken up by local government functionaries, but were not. All right. So I think here I'm just going to hand over to Aishwarya to sort of detail the research objectives and the specific methodology that we employed.
Okay. So Aarushi's just taken us through the first objective of our research project, which is basically to just understand the gamut of problems of exclusionary factors that really exist and try to do that analysis from user-generated content, right? So to this end, what we have effectively done is we have used a database of complaints that have been collected using the Granbani network. And we have pre-processed that complaints data and done a sort of a coding exercise. And I'll explain that a bit further in just a moment. We've done a coding exercise and assigned a code to every call which belongs to a particular stage of exclusion. So we had about 1,000 complaints for which we have done this exercise. And right after that has been the analysis of that coded data, has been just a quantitative analysis. And also we also look into how prevalent exclusion is at each stage, each of the E1, E2, E3, E4 stages that Aarushi has mentioned. We also look at the spatial and temporal analysis of these sources of exclusion. Now, one limitation that we kind of faced when we were going through with this highly quantitative analysis was the fact that the level of information that we get varies across complaints, right? And for that reason, we felt that there is a need to supplement this quantitative methodology with a more qualitative approach as well. And that's where these deep dive case studies really come in. So we selected a couple of case studies from this database of 1,000 calls, and we used a critical case sampling method to do so. And we really went into the local context of a particular grievance complaint. And we really went into the impact that it had on the beneficiary in terms of search costs, in terms of foregone benefits. And these are not things that it might strike a citizen to, claim as a problem by themselves. But when prompted, you do realize that if there is an extensive search cost associated, then a person might be, say, missing a day's wage. So that kind of like level of detail really came out through these deep dive case studies. So that is one limitation that I just talked about, that the level of information kind of varies greatly across the complaints. Another issue that we were able to realize once the whole exercise is complete was the fact that the representation of complaints at the E4 stage, that is the cash withdrawal stage, was quite low actually. So we found that people were not reporting issues related to cash out infrastructure. So these might be issues where there is a network failure, or they are being overcharged by, say, a bank manager, things like that. So people are not reporting these issues as often as we sort of might expect. So one hypothesis we have here is that such issues, people might not turn to a civil society organization to represent such issues. And it's just the fact that if there are very few banking access points in your area, that might not really come out as a grievance in the first place, in the face of possibly other grievances that prevent their access to certain welfare schemes. So I'll just take you through this pre-processing of complaints data and what exactly this coding exercise really means. So what we essentially did was, for this database of 1,000 calls, the first and foremost objective was to extract the most relevant information from the recording and use that information to identify which stage of exclusion a particular case belongs to. And by stage of exclusion, I mean the E1, E2, E3, E4 breakup that Aarushi has been talking about so far. So I can just do that with the help of an example. So this is actually a transcription of one of the recordings that feature in our data set. And it says, I had applied for a disabled pension 5 years ago to the village head, but I have still not received it, and the application has been pending for a long time. Okay, so in a case like this, we know that there's a very limited amount of information that comes out, right? So what sort of becomes important is certain assumptions that we become forced to make regarding every single case. So for instance, in this particular case, the person has given us sufficient information to say that my application has indeed been pending. But it's not necessary that every person who makes a complaint has this level of knowledge. So just that aside, the next step that we would go to is just using a simple binary coding exercise to put down a 1 under the column which this particular case would belong to. So here, since we know that it's at the application stage and the application has been pending for 5 years, we know that it is indeed an enrollment procedure problem. And within enrollment procedure as well, we have certain divisions, right? And I think this is also something Aarushi has explained earlier, that within enrollment procedures, we have two sections. It can either be a documentation requirement problem, or it can be an application processing issue. So here, since the person indicates that they have submitted the application, but it has been pending for some unknown reason, that points to the fact that it's indeed an application processing issue. So we put on a 1 under that column and a 0 in the other. So by repeating this exercise for multiple calls, we get a data set which looks something like this. And this is kind of what really forms the basis of the analysis that we do. Sorry, Aarushi, you're on mute.
Great. Thanks, Aishwarya. Okay, so for the purpose of this session, we decided, and since we've covered multiple schemes, around 7 DBT schemes, MGNREGA, PDS, as well as Provident Fund, we thought we would dedicate this presentation to one category of schemes, which is the direct benefit transfer schemes. And we would take you through the sources of exclusion, as well as the resolution pathways that are employed by Granbani volunteers. So to begin with, and as Aishwarya details, we've looked at DBT scheme specific complaints for the period of March to November 2020. And if we look at the scheme-wise breakup of this entire cohort, we see that the maximum number of complaints that came in were pertaining to Tamil Nadu State Welfare Board transfers. Now, post the lockdown, we saw that a lot of welfare boards across the country introduced these ex gratia ad hoc cash transfers that were to be transferred to all registered persons of the welfare board. But and these were simply part of the relief packages the governments had introduced during the lockdown to alleviate a lot of economic distress. We see in our database that Tamil Nadu State Welfare Board forms the most number of complaints, and a specific reason has got to do with the Granbani model and the geographical I would say the geographical representation as well. So we see in Tamil Nadu, Granbani volunteers were working closely with the labor board. So we do see that a lot of complainants called in related to Tamil Nadu State Welfare Board simply because they knew Granbani had that established relationship with the labor board. The second most prominent category of DBT schemes is pensions, and these would not just include old age pension, but also disability and widow pension under the broader umbrella of the NSAP, or the National Social Assistance Program. The third major category, which we've sort of clubbed together, are state schemes. So this is again going back to the COVID-19 lockdown. A lot of state governments introduced rupees 500, rupees 1,000 to be simply transferred to beneficiaries directly into their bank accounts, and they had varying eligibility criteria across states. Right. So, for example, in Bihar, we do see that the state government announced rupees 1,000 for people who did not hold a ration card, for instance. The next big category is PM Kisan, where around 12% of all complaints belonged to this scheme. Then we see the PMGKY category. Now, PMGKY was the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana relief package that was announced on 26 March 2020 by the finance minister, and it included a whole spectrum of benefits, including ex gratia cash as well as ex gratia in-kind transfers. And a part of that was that all women beneficiaries or holding a Jan Dhan account will receive rupees 500 into their accounts. And we also saw that a similar provision for all pension beneficiaries as well, where they would receive rupees 500 as part of an ex gratia transfer over a period of 3 months. So that would be April, May, and June 2020. The next, we see that even there were benefits announced for Ujjwala beneficiaries, where free cylinders were announced for all registered beneficiaries for the next 3 months. And of course, we do see that some of the ex gratia transfers were extended beyond June 2020, specifically, I think, the PDS provisions of distributing free ration. Right. Okay, so now coming specifically to the sources of exclusion within the DBT scheme, we see that the most prominent source of exclusion has been the failure of benefit crediting, that a lot of people who were registered under DBT schemes simply did not receive the money they were entitled to, hence making them fall under E3 category. And this is approximately, as you can see, around 80% of all complaints fall into this category. And of these cases, of course, simply by virtue of having the preponderance of Tamil Nadu State Welfare Board complaints, 40% of these complaints fall under this category, followed by pensions, which is around 16%. And as discussed earlier, we do see that there is in general a lower percentage of cash withdrawal issues within the entire data set. The second highest category, although there is quite a gap between E3 and E2, is enrollment procedures, where people complained saying that they're unable to enroll into a DBT scheme. And just to, I think we can skip this slide, Kevin, simply for the sake of time. Just to quickly give you a temporal progression as to how have the complaints, their frequency changed between March to November 2020. We do see that a lot of these failure of benefit crediting calls peaked in the month of April, which is the first month of the PMGKY rollout as a scheme. And we see that these complaints of people complaining that they haven't received any money sort of peter out up until August, September. And we do see a slight peak in October as well. Coming to the possible reasons as to why people may not have received their benefits, we first see that people might fail to receive their benefits because there might be errors that might have been committed during the enrollment stage. And these are typically data entry errors. So in case there's an Aadhaar error or a spelling error, how the DBT backend is designed is that in case the name doesn't match within the NPCI mapper, which is the National Payment Corporation of India, they have a mapper, which is nothing but a repository of all Aadhaar numbers and bank account details, which helps to sort of re-verify beneficiaries and assess their eligibility. In case there's any data error there, your payment simply fails. There are also issues related to pending Know Your Customer norms. So in case you haven't updated your KYC at your local bank branch, the system might flag that as an anomaly and refuse to transfer your payments. Third thing, and you'll see that a lot of these issues are closely linked to the banking infrastructure of the country, which we see that a lot of citizens face this issue of closing and freezing of bank accounts. And this is specifically true for a lot of low-income segments where maybe the frequency with which they transact in their bank accounts might not be that high. And what banks occasionally do is during their data cleaning exercise, they sort of close or freeze certain bank accounts which really haven't met the transaction limits, or they have been lying dormant for a while. And the next possible reason, as I discussed earlier, is simply an Aadhaar seeding issue in the NPCI mapper. And lastly, something that's very easy to resolve but still keeps popping up as a main problem is issues in Aadhaar details. So we see that during the Aadhaar enrollment drives, given that it was something that was done with a lot of enthusiasm but a lot of rush as well, is that a lot of ad hoc Aadhaar enrollment camps popped up everywhere across the country. And at that time, you were not supposed to provide, especially your date of birth. There was no need to provide a date of birth proof. So we We saw a lot of people simply estimating their ages and putting in, and the system flags an error only later on when it's verified with other documents. So we do see a lot of these issues come in with respect to simply documentation and data entry errors. Um, the last bit of here about possible reasons is that there might be an Aadhaar linkage problem, which we saw in Amit's case, that his bank account, somebody else's bank account was linked to his application, and hence when the system tried to verify whether this is the correct Aadhaar for the bank account, it returned an error. Now, I just wanted to also show some of the excerpts that we've received from citizens in this particular category, where people have reported saying that someone's mother's widow pension wasn't received. They applied in October 2019, application was accepted, but the pension amount had not been credited up until late 2020. Next is, I haven't received PM Kisan money for past 5 months. I used to get rupees 2,000 previously. I've given my Aadhaar copy to the village head 5 months ago to fix the problem, but nothing has happened. And we also see issues related to, I haven't received any money under PM Kisan. I'd filled forms. I've submitted it to the Lekpal, who's the village registrar, and data checks have revealed that there is some problem in my bank details, right? So a typical representation of the issues we just described above. Now, Ishwara, if you could just come in for the research methodology for our second segment of the report.
Absolutely. So just to take us through the second objective of our study once again, is basically we are aiming to find out how the Granbani volunteers really assist citizens and help them achieve that resolution of a particular grievance, right? Specific to various welfare entitlements. So in order to sort of achieve this objective, the first and foremost thing we did was to really trawl through the database of impact stories that are recorded by the Granbani volunteers. So as Aarushi mentioned when she was discussing the model of how Granbani functions, an important aspect of what they do is the volunteers really come out and they they just create a recording after an issue has been resolved. And that recording contains 3 pieces of key information. First is what exactly the issue was and how they diagnosed it. Second is the action that has been taken by the volunteer in order to pursue resolution. And thirdly is the impact that has been realized for the citizen. So now by really listening to these set of recordings, we were able to come up with a sort of framework which helped us to understand the typology of actions that volunteers take. And those are the 4 icons and the 4 codes that you see on the top of your screen, which is basically A0, A1, A2A, and A2B. So just quickly to take everyone through these 4 codes, this basically comprises something that we are calling our impact framework. So as of now, there are 2 frameworks, the exclusion framework, which tells you the various sources of exclusion, and the impact framework, which tells you the action pathways that are taken by volunteers in pursuit of resolution. So volunteers have various options, and this is what we see from this impact stories database, is that they have the option to just simply provide information to the citizen and say, okay, this is the amount of information you require in order to pursue resolution on your own. So there's no direct mediation that the volunteer really gets themselves into. Another option is, and another very frequently used option is issue escalation to higher officials, or what we are calling as A1, which is basically the escalation of an issue, just bumping it up to officials, local officials at slightly higher levels. So maybe the block or the district level officials, just to bring certain issues to their notice and put some top-down pressure on local functionaries. So that's A1. Now, the next 2, which are A2A and A2B, are both action pathways where the volunteer assumes a more direct role. So they really come in as, in order to directly assist the person in achieving resolution. So they can either directly resolve the issue on the citizen's behalf, and that, for example, that might just involve, let's say, submitting certain documents at the bank, or it might be something such as updating erroneous Aadhaar details at a local kiosk center. The other one, which is A2B, interaction with access points, is also very interesting in that the volunteer sometimes does not actually take any drastic action, but it's just a different representation to an access point. And this is a pathway we saw very commonly used in when there are issues in the PDS system, where there are complaints against the local fair price shop officer, and that they are behaving in an inappropriate or improper manner. So it's just that the volunteer decides to represent the issue and interact with the access point and try to make a case to them. So this is broadly our impact framework. Now, another part of the research methodology, I've already told you about, going through the impact stories database, but to really supplement that, we felt it was really important to get the opinions of volunteers and really vet this impact framework and make sure that how we are ideating the way the volunteers work was actually correct. So we did this through semi-structured interviews of the volunteers. And these interviews were broadly guided by a decision tree sort of format. So we would basically present a decision tree to the volunteer, and each node of that decision tree represented a decision of various hierarchies. And the question presented to them was, if a citizen approaches you with a particular type of issue, what do you do? And most importantly, what we wanted to know was the motivation behind why they really use that particular action pathway. So that's where this interview of volunteers really comes in. Another really important exercise that we undertook was interviewing local government functionaries across states. Now, this helped us really provide a lot of specific local context to why certain issues exist in certain locations, as well as why volunteers are required to take the actions that they take. So where exactly is the system failing? What is the issue at the local government level? So those are some of the insights that came out from interviews that we conducted with local government functionaries as well. And some examples of these government officials are the are the village registrars, I think we also spoke to a block development officer in some instance, and so on. Now, just to tie this back to our first research objective, where we used a data set of almost 1,000 calls, and we were able to take a more quantitative approach in that case. Something that is a bit lacking in this study is the fact that the impact stories database and the initial database, which is just citizen generated complaints, do not exactly correspond to one another. And you can clearly see that by the difference in number between the first research objective and the second, right? So just the fact that the citizens' exclusion complaints don't overlap with the impact stories makes it a little difficult for us to tie back research objective 1 with research objective 2, which is why we have tried to supplement as much as possible with qualitative interviews with volunteers and so on.
So for just going forward, we are going to focus on only one scheme, which is the PM Kisan scheme, a scheme we also used in the first case study illustrating Amit's case. So here we'll be broadly looking at the hierarchy of resolution pathways that have been used by volunteers. And I'm going to take you through a flow chart that we've created to sort of understand how volunteers operate and what insights do these actions have for grievance redress mechanisms going forward for both policymakers as well as CSOs, right? You will see that we've divided the flow chart into all the different kinds of issues. First, for enrollment issues, what do people do? For payment issues, what do volunteers do? And similarly for cash out issues, starting from the point of citizen grievance being received by them, right up to the point of resolution. In case you're wondering, we do have that one particular gap here where we are not covering E1 throughout the project. Now, E1 was all about targeting and methodologies and eligibility rules, something that we feel this particular research methodology wasn't exactly suited to that kind of point of exclusion, because a lot of people who've been excluded, who might have been excluded due to E1 or eligibility, obviously are not aware that it is in ineligibility reason, or it is the fault lines in a particular proxy means test that has deprived them of a particular scheme benefit. However, we do cover targeting methodologies for the relief packages, because the relief packages were designed using eligibility rules, and we did see evidence within the complaints of people complaining against those eligibility rules. So for instance, you'll see in case of PMGKY, ex gratia, PDS and transfers, only ration card holders could get the free ration. So a lot of people called in saying that I am poor, I've run out of food, there are no shops open. The ration shop, the person is turning me away because I do not have a ration card. So why can't we also get the free ration from the government? So we've categorized some of those cases as E1 exclusion for different schemes that we do not cover in this session, but for more details, I'll also add a link to the full report in this video. Next, we first start with the enrollment issues in PM Kisan. And we see that when a citizen dials in to report any kind of enrollment issue, there can be two scenarios. Either the citizen demands assistance from the volunteer, or either they simply demand more information. In case it's only information that the citizen seeks, it's fairly simple. Volunteers employ A0, which is information provision to the citizen. And we do not know the efficacy of such cases because we haven't really followed complainants here in case the complainants are themselves going and resolving issues. So our flowchart ends here for the A0 category. But in case the citizen has demanded assistance from the volunteer, we see that in most enrollment cases in PM Kisan, the most prominent pathway has been A to B. Now, A to B, if you recall, has been interaction with access point. Now, this broadly includes interaction or mediation with the farmer consultant, which is the Kisan Salahkar, who are based in villages and form the most accessible local point for both volunteers and citizens. And in some cases for UP and Madhya Pradesh, it's the village registrar, colloquially known as the Patwari or the Lekpal. Right? And we see that under this particular action pathway, volunteers go and talk to these officials, they make the case on the citizen's behalf, they inquire, they ask them as to why a person's application has not been processed. And in case the citizen has reported that, okay, my Patwari is charging me a bribe to simply take my application, can you please go and talk to him? This is also what we see volunteers doing. Now, A to B or any of these interactions may also include warnings that if you do not comply, I'm going to escalate the issue, which is what we see in A1. So now what happens is A to B might fail in a couple of cases. So the interaction with the access point does not resolve the citizen grievance. And these might be because of two key reasons. The first reason is that the local official simply refuses to cooperate. And we see that happening quite extensively simply due to the dearth of accountability and monitoring mechanisms in the last mile. The second reason why this might fail, the A to B interaction might fail, is because the function that's required to assist the citizen might simply be outside of the capacity of the local official. Right. And it is under these two scenarios, we see the volunteers resorting to A1, which is issue escalation to officials in case of PM Kisan, such as the block agriculture officer or even the sub-divisional magistrate. And we also looked at the typical typology of issues that have been escalated, and these include bank account linkage, back-end validation checks, where local functionaries either have insufficient information or they simply do not have the official wherewithal to process the grievance. Now coming to the resolution pathways for payment issues, Now, very interestingly, PM Kisan has a farmer's portal available on the website where you can key in your Aadhaar or your phone number, you can log in and you can edit your Aadhaar details, which, as I discussed earlier, does form an important or a prominent point of exclusion. So the foremost thing that volunteers do is that itself. They go online and they check the status of the citizen, they check their installment status. And how the portal looks like is basically it would provide you the beneficiary details along with the Aadhaar bank account number, and it would help you track first installment, second installment, third installment, as well as in some cases the reason of failure. Now, sometimes that online status check might give you sufficient information, and in some cases it might not give you sufficient information. So let's say let's take the first scenario where I log in as a volunteer and the portal does provide me with sufficient information, for example, saying that the payment has been rejected due to Aadhaar errors. In such case, the volunteers are equipped with the information to take the next step, which we see in the PM Kisan case to be mostly of A2A. Now, A2A, if you recall, is direct resolution on citizens' behalf, where volunteers simply log into the portal and edit the details, right? Or it could, in some cases, simply be approaching a local official and submitting a written complaint, maybe. Right? So these are all official mechanisms that are available to citizens, but for some reason they're unable to navigate that system, either because they're digitized and hence citizens find it simply they're uncomfortable to file a complaint, a written complaint, and hence the volunteers assist them. Now, A2A might also fail, and this happens in two cases, right? We have when the first case is when A2A fails is specifically related to KYC issues. Now, what KYC norms mandate is that when your KYC has to be updated with a bank, the beneficiary or the bank customer himself or herself must visit the bank branch, right? So this is where the volunteer can't do anything on citizen behalf. So what they end up doing simply is to accompany the beneficiary to bank branch and help them navigate the system and interact with the bank officials to explain the issue. So this is where A2A fails and A2B comes in. Now, the next the next scenario here was when the portal doesn't provide you with enough information as to why the payment has been pending. And this is where we see issue escalation happening simply to diagnose the problem. So volunteers have frequently approached block level officials to understand the reason for payment failure. They've, in many instances, especially I think in the case of Madhya Pradesh, volunteers told us that they've sort of created an informal relationship with the computer operators who are based out of the block office. And every time citizens flag these issues, they simply go to the computer operator, try to understand what's gone wrong, and then they go back to this process where they might proceed with A2A and A2B. Coming to our last set of issues, which is on cash out, we see that these might include overcrowding at banking points. These might include fraudulent activities happening at the common service center, at the citizen service point, or the banking correspondent, or any other irregularities associated with their operations. Now, what we see under cash out is a very simple hierarchy of actions. The first and foremost thing that most volunteers do is to simply go and interact with the customer service point and apply pressure tactics that if you continue this particular non-compliant activity, we will go and complain to the bank manager, right? And something we saw during COVID is that if you do not sort of build in a protocol of maintaining social distancing at your local access point, we're going to escalate this issue to higher officials at the block level. And the next set of action pathways within cash out is simply issue escalation, where the issues might be very grave. So we saw in PM Kisan for Madhya Pradesh, that there was a group of customer service points who were going door to door and collecting information of PM Kisan beneficiaries using their biometrics, giving them the amount, but only after having taken a cut from that particular entitlement. And we do see that in this particular instance, after this issue was broadcasted on Granbani community radio, the district collector took notice and sort of provided strict instructions as to please to discontinue the practice, right? So I think that's all under the resolution pathways for PM Kisan, and what I have in what we have in front of us now is simply like a zoomed out version of the previous glossary of exclusion that we'd begun with. And for further details on how exclusion and resolution pathways have played out across the other schemes that we unfortunately haven't been able to cover in this session, you can refer to the full text of the report, which would be released in March 2021. Just summarizing the broad insights now. We start with, now we see that we've looked at 4 key action pathways. We see that issue escalation is happening, resolution on citizen behalf, interaction with access point, and information provision. And these insights have been collated for across the schemes. And we see that A1 or issue escalation is a method used for most schemes which have a very top-down structure. So PM Kisan, for instance, which is a scheme that is implemented by which has been introduced by the central government, and all the databases, the entirety of the database management is a very centralized system. So even if an error correction happens in the last mile, it has to be validated by the upper tiers of the scheme administration. So that's why we see that issue escalation is, of course, a much needed resolution pathway. Now we saw that for schemes even which have a decentralized implementation mechanism, and these can include the public distribution system or even the MGNREGA, where the local government functionaries do have considerable official capacity, we saw that issue escalation happens in cases when these officials either are not performing well or they are simply refusing to cooperate. The third thing we saw issue escalation is used in those cases where the official grievance redress mechanisms are very cumbersome for the citizen to navigate. And we do see then that volunteers and citizens bypass the official architecture and simply escalate the issue because they really don't understand how to navigate the official process. And lastly, we see issue escalation as, again, the pathway of last resort, where if everything else fails, let's just go to somebody who has more power than local functionaries. We also see something, a really interesting feature under issue escalation. Now, issue escalation can happen through writing letters to local officials. It can happen by simply approaching to their offices. But we do see another interesting method that Granbani volunteers employ, which is simply local advocacy, where they write letters to government officials, making the case and citing evidence that this particular issue is happening to an X number of people and must be addressed ASAP. So they do sort of mobilize around that issue and try to generate attention towards that particular case. The next is a resolution on citizen behalf, or A2A, and we see that this has been prominent for schemes with front-end mechanisms for complaint filing, application tracking, data correction, which is what we see in the PM Kisan case, which has a farmers portal. Interaction with access point, or A2B, is prominent only in cases where there's lack of cooperation on part of these officials or local banking agents. And lastly, information provision is mostly being used when the volunteers feel that the citizen is equipped enough that once they provide the relevant information, he or she has the capacity to resolve the issue on their own. And this might simply be that if, let's say, they teach them how to navigate the digitized interface, they know that the citizens can pick it up easily and pursue the resolution on their own. Lastly, I just wanted to end this session, and of course, we haven't been able to summarize the entire 150 pages of the report here, but just to highlight the key parts of the report, we do focus on the importance of having an official complaints repository for the schemes that we've covered, and how important it is to institutionalize certain grievance redress mechanisms, which would also enable citizens to easily document their complaints. Because right now what we see is that the grievance redress mechanisms, even while they are in place, there is that issue of low uptake where citizens do not really employ these official methods. So we look at the three key effects having a complaints repository might have. Well, our first and foremost is that in case we build a complaints repository with an easy access channel, such as IVR in this case, and there are multiple other technological innovations that are available to both local governments and CSOs to collate complaints from citizens. It would enhance the access to grievance redress. It would activate a readily accessible, low charge touch point for customers to begin with. Second is having a complaints repository which would detail all the complaints, the reason as to why an issue is failing. It would enable government departments to sort of gain insights, and specifically region-specific insights on the most pressing citizen issues for a given scheme. And we do see that such a system is currently not existing in a lot of schemes. Last is such a complaints repository will also enhance transparency. It would also enable an evidence-based performance monitoring of a lot of local government functionaries. Because right now, if a citizen approaches the Patwari or the village registrar to expressing their grievance, it isn't recorded in any manner, right? And there is no way to even hold that local official accountable that somebody approached you with a grievance and it continues to remain unresolved, as we saw in this case.